Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Tuesday, January 28th, 2020. The impeachment trial of Donald Trump has turned another corner as his dream team of Republican lawyers wrapped up their weak, lame, and very brief arguments in the Senate trial today. So it's been an interesting process, and as you know, I've been reporting on yesterday's events today because of the way that the events last week went long into the night. But the Republicans, they like those banker hours, and they don't like to pressure the senators too much. Now, they did repeat the same talking points, just like the Democrats did. But theirs, I think, are far less compelling and rely on confidence in the president and belief beyond denial of obvious evidence that is before so many of us. Now, let me restate, in case you're just listening here for the first time in a while, I still believe that the Democrats have made significant errors in the way they chose to produce or proceed with impeachment. And as you know, fundamentally, the failure to include the actual crimes proven by the Michael Cohen plea deal of Trump's direction of his payment of hush money to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. The absence of that in the impeachment articles is a huge blunder, because so many of the arguments that I'm about to cite that the Republicans have thrown up are based on this thin claim that you can't impeach over the broad claim of abuse of power. And since you can't impeach over that, the obstruction of abuse of power is a what Don Jr. would like to call a nothing burger as well. And so had they just, spent 20 minutes back in the Intelligence Committee hearing and half an hour in the Judiciary hearing in the House and included this third article about the clear crime that was committed there, I believe they would be on much stronger footing. And as I have also commented on frequently, the risks posed by ripping open the odyssey of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden in Ukraine is a serious, unexploded landmine for the Democrats. And, as we'll get to in a moment, in yesterday's hearings, there was, a case that was made. I'll describe it a little more in a bit. But it's going to play very well on Fox News, and it will fuel the denial and the blind support of the Trump mob for their boss, I believe, in ways that the Democrats will regret. So really just 2 hours into the oral arguments today, the Trump team stood down, they rested their case, and they had a lot of time left on the clock. But they decided less is more. And when you don't have more of a case, well, you don't want to draw attention to that. But all of this is overshadowed by John Bolton. And as I've suggested, it's a risky bet to think that he is going to ride in on a white horse with his white mustache and save the day. But the Democrats are kind of painted into a corner, because Trump could, I think, legitimately claim executive privilege over Mick Mulvaney. He's the acting chief of staff who really was, in the control room for the Ukraine scheme. He's the one who went to a press conference and said, yeah, quid pro quo, you're damn right. And despite the damaging public statements, I do think that Trump would be able to preclude him from appearing before a Senate trial. But not so John Bolton. He's free as a bird. He left the Trump nest back in September. We weren't really clear at the time what busted up his buddy affair with Trump. But now it's clear from the calculated leaks of the manuscript of Bolton's book, which is already number 17 on the Amazon best-selling list before it's published, I think, in early March. And he's certainly made a splash. And his supporters note that he already received a $2 million advance for the book, so the idea that he's doing this purely to make money off the book, I think, is a little weak. But we do have to look at his motivation. He is a movement conservative. He and Trump share a lot of hard right-wing ideology. He certainly supports Trump, the attack on General Soleimani, and the confrontation with Iran. He would like to see us invade Iran. But the leak of his book has really created serious problems for the Republicans in the Senate, who until then were free to say, well, we haven't seen any evidence. We haven't seen anything new. The Democrats have created a narrative, but so what? And then they back off with commentary from a criminal defense attorney and professor, a guy named Alan Dershowitz, who is not a constitutional lawyer. But that was the role he played when he basically said that these two articles do not reach the level of impeachment and removal of a president, no matter what, even if everything Bolton is saying is true. And yesterday's presentations were bookended by Ken Starr and by Alan Dershowitz, both of whom were strange in the arguments that they made. Ken Starr was saying that, impeachment is such a nightmare that it should only happen once a century. And when he drove the Whitewater investigation that became the Lewinsky blowjob investigation, and Clinton was caught lying under oath, he said that was the legitimate impeachment of the century, and so this one simply cannot qualify. And I thought both of those presentations were pretty weak, but they do give fig leaves to Republicans who want to cover the bits they don't want you to see. So here's the narrative from the New York Times that in the latest leak from the book, Bolton privately told Attorney General Bill Barr last year that he had concerns that Trump was effectively granting personal favors to the autocratic leaders of Turkey and China. And Barr responded by pointing to a pair of Justice Department investigations of companies in those countries, said that he had worried that Trump had created the appearance that he had undue influence over what would typically be independent investigations. And backing up this point, Barr mentioned conversations Trump had with leaders like Erdogan of Turkey and Xi Jinping of China. Bolton's now this is all denied by the Barr Justice Department flack, but Bolton's account underscores the unease of Trump's seeming embrace of authoritarian leaders, long expressed by experts and his opponents. And while these are not really germane to the trial, they show a broader range of corrupt behavior, insider dealing, authoritarian tendencies that would normally cause Republicans to, say, this is wrong. I wouldn't do this, and so I can't tolerate it from a president. But, of course, these are not times where rational thinking prevails. So here's the statement from the Justice Department. There was no discussion of personal favors or undue influence on investigations, nor did Barr state that the president's conversations with foreign leaders were improper. If this is truly what Bolton has written, it seems he's attributing to the Attorney General his own current views, with which Attorney General Barr does not agree. Then Bolton's publishers went public saying there was absolutely no coordination. We did not leak this to the New York Times or anyone else. Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the Times, said the Times doesn't discuss its sources, but I should point out that no one has questioned the accuracy of our report. Now, one of the ways that Trump et al. Can dismiss this is by noting that nobody has actually seen, and none of the reporters who have written about it have even seen the manuscript. It has been described to them by people who have seen it. And I was struck this morning, I had CNN on for a few minutes, and Jake Tapper adopted a new standard of evidence for journalism. He never applied it during the Russiagate narrative, But in this case, he's saying, look, we have to treat this with some skepticism because the reporters don't have a copy of the book. They are relying on accounts of people telling them about what they said. Now, I applaud Jake Tapper in this moment, but I would invite him to be more consistent going forward. So these revelations, both the ones that are germane to the Ukraine charges before the Senate and those that are not, do, I think, cause Republicans to squirm. But will they squirm more than they would when Trump trash tweets them? That's the calculation that's in their minds. And if they are subject to his invective, will they survive politically? And as many of you know, I have long argued that until you threaten those Republicans with direct loss of their political future, that they will continue to fear Trump more than really backlash from failing to expose the truth. So Jonathan Stevenson is a former appointee of Obama to the National Security Council, and he writes about John Bolton in an op-ed in today's New York Times. And he tries to discern what he calls in the headline, the method in John Bolton's madness. Why is he doing this? Well, he says the first is patriotism. While Bolton does hold extreme views about the use of American power, there's little doubt about his basic fealty to the U.S. constitutional system and to established American institutions. Second, he says he has professional principles. Well, I will allow Mr. Stevenson's view, but with my demurral, I'm sorry. He's been unprofessional in so many ways. Then another explanation is personal indignation and greed. And as I mentioned, he already got a $2 million advance. And then he cites one more possible motive, personal ambition. And this is the one I agree with, because John Bolton harbors presidential dreams. He almost ran in 2015. He has his own political action committee that he doles out money to Republicans from. And in this case, once again, borrowing the metaphor of the card game hearts, is he shooting the moon? In order to shoot the moon, you have to set all the other players. And then you ding them 26 negative points, and you come out the winner. Can Bolton pull off a moonshot in this climate? It is a high risk maneuver. It's a 30-1 horse race odds. But Bolton has little to lose. If Trumpism continues, he won't have a job in a Pence administration or a Don Jr. or Ivanka administration. Perish the thoughts. But he operates in the Republican soup. And he may believe there's a way to take down Trump and to have John Bolton come out on top. The editors of the New York Times are working on persuading and pressuring some of those Republican senators. They take on Roy Blunt of Missouri, quoting him, "Unless there's a witness who's going to change the outcome, I can't imagine why we would want to stretch this out for weeks and months." And the editors say, this tautology gives away the game. All witness testimony to date, all presented as part of the House impeachment proceedings, has only strengthened the case against Trump, but Republicans will not vote to convict him under any circumstances. By definition, then, no witness in the Senate could possibly change the outcome. Enter, stage right, John Bolton. The editorial continues, this has scrambled the strategy. Bolton's foreign policy disagreements with Trump have been public knowledge for months. Fiona Hill, a Russia expert and former aide to Bolton, testified in the House that Bolton was alarmed by Trump's aid for investigation scheme, which Bolton characterized as a drug deal. So it remains to be seen if any of these Republicans can be peeled away from their love of Trump and their fear of Trump, and I would argue that the fear is the greater concern. So today, there are efforts to get access to Bolton's book. We'll talk about that in a minute. I want you to consider the source here. Barbara McQuaid is a former U.S. attorney from Detroit, and she teaches at the University of Michigan Law School in Ann Arbor, and she's a frequent contributor to the Russiagate narrative on MSNBC. But she has a pretty powerful op-ed in the Washington Post today. And she argues that based on Trump's tweets calling John Bolton a liar over the reports of this book manuscript, that his tweets directly dispute the truth of these claims. And in the process, Trump has probably waived any executive privilege that he could have claimed to keep Bolton quiet if that gambit fails. That gambit being getting the Senate Republicans to flush this away without new witnesses. So she continues. On Saturday, Trump's lawyers argued that not a single witness testified that the president himself said there was any connection between investigations, security assistance, a presidential meeting, or anything else. That statement was literally true, but now it appears to have been deeply misleading because the next day the Times reported that Bolton's book says Trump told Bolton in August that he wanted to continue to hold the military funding until the Ukrainian government agreed to announce investigations into Democrats, including Joe and Hunter Biden. And then when Trump fires back on Twitter, quote, I never told John Bolton that the aid to Ukraine was tied to investigations into Democrats, including the Bidens. In fact, he never complained about this at the time of his very public termination. If John Bolton said this, it was only to sell a book. McQuaid continues, if Trump fails in persuading the Senate that witnesses are unnecessary, then his best hope for preventing Bolton from providing damaging testimony is by asserting executive privilege. But since he has publicly called this witness a liar, it raises important issues. And she says the executive privilege argument is no longer available. Trump's tweets directly denying the substance of Bolton's reported allegations waive any privilege that might have protected them from public disclosure. So, as I mentioned, I thought that Alan Dershowitz's commentary about the fact that these are not, in his view, impeachable offenses, and Ken Starr's lumbering prose about the Constitution, his replay of his role as the special prosecutor of Bill Clinton, I didn't find much substance in any of that. But I have to say, when Pam Bondi came to the podium, I guess she calls herself Bondi, I paused and paid attention. Now, consider who Pam Bondi is. Former Attorney General of the state of Florida. Her office was investigating Trump University. She killed the investigation, and Trump wrote her a check for $25,000 to her campaign fund from his phony foundation. She accepted that check. Anybody who's even been close to a law school knows that you cannot mix those kinds of funds. And she ultimately did return Trump's contributions. And she paid him back more than $25,000 in her presentation yesterday. Because first she praised Rudy Giuliani as an international fighter of corruption. Ukraine was just the latest battlefield for Rudy. But when she went into her detailed narrative about Joe Biden being appointed by Obama to help root out corruption in Ukraine after the U.S.-backed coup, 2014, and of course, they never mention the nature of that coup, the U.S. involvement, the way we handpicked Poroshenko, the next president of Ukraine. That appears to be, there's some polite agreement that nobody will delve into that set of issues because that could be damaging to Joe Biden as well. So in her presentation, she went into great detail. She cited specific dates and claimed that there was a nexus between meetings that Biden had at the White House with Hunter and his two business partners 2 days before. Hunter and one of the guys named Devin, I don't have his name in front of me, they both took seats on the Burisma board. She reports that they were each paid $83,333 a month for 17 months to show up twice a year for meetings. and allow their names to be used or show up in videos occasionally. And she painted a picture. Much of it was linked through half-truths and through juxtaposition of timing, as I just mentioned. But what she presented was a case that was custom-built for Fox News. And excerpts from Bondi's presentation will be used to keep the Biden story in play. So this remains a significant vulnerability of the Democrats, both in the impeachment trial, and we don't know where it's going to go after the question period that could take up to 16 hours over the next 2 days. Friday is deadline day. That's when they will have the debate about whether to have a debate about inviting new witnesses and accepting fresh evidence, like Lev Parnas's video of Trump ordering the firing of Ambassador Yovanovitch. So between now and then, we're not really sure what the questions might reveal. My expectation is that it's not going to show us much new. It's going to be repetition of matters and denials that have already been raised in this trial. But I would suggest that this is the most fluid period of this kind of unpredictable impeachment process. This is where the senators are jockeying in their party caucuses and to some extent among each other, even across the aisle, to determine about witnesses. And if witnesses are introduced, it will change things dramatically. It will draw out the length of the trial. There'll have to be some sort of a break so that they can depose the witnesses before they decide to either bring in the testimony from the depositions or have them testify live before the senators. These are all known unknowns at this point. And it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. So Chris Van Hollen, who's a Democrat from Maryland in the Senate, said that he's considering reintroducing a motion that would allow Chief Justice Roberts to decide which witnesses should be heard. And get this, he was invited on Fox News. So he said, well, since the Bolton manuscript has come to light, all the momentum here is in favor of calling relevant fact witnesses. Now, I don't disagree with that. I'd also like to see the Democrats introduce a motion calling for secret ballot votes from here forward. And as Ron Fine, who's the co-author of the impeachment book called The Constitution Demands It, on our recent podcast, he advocated for a secret ballot which would allow Republicans to vote Trump out, or at least vote against him, even on procedural motions, without being Twitter targets. Lindsey Graham said that now he's heard about the Bolton book. He supports a proposal by his Republican colleague from Oklahoma, James Lankford, to allow senators to read Bolton's manuscript in a classified setting. Now, this is laughable, and Chuck Schumer got off some bombs about that, this is just a book, and you don't need to go into a secret soundproof booth in order to read it. But then Trump learned that Chris Van Hollen had been on Fox. He hit the Twitter. Quote, really pathetic how Fox News is trying to be so politically correct by loading the airwaves at Democrats like Chris Van Hollen, the no-name senator from Maryland. He just helped him with his name ID. He's been on forever playing up the impeachment hoax. Next tweet. So what the hell has happened at Fox News? Chris Wallace and others should be on fake news CNN or MSDNC. How's Shep Smith doing? Watch. This will be the beginning of the end for Fox, just like the other two which are dying in the ratings. Social media is great. In the jockeying and horse trading among the senators over the witness and evidence question, the Democrats are trying to carve out positions that would keep Republicans from demanding to hear from Hunter or Joe Biden or Adam Schiff, who they consider to be the guy who concocted the whole Ukraine scheme. And it's fair to say there are vulnerabilities there where Schiff has never talked about what happened to the whistleblowers. Schiff has never addressed the Republican attacks that he or his staff met with the first CIA whistleblower before the complaint was surfaced. And so the Republicans have been gunning for Schiff since Pat Cipollone's opening comments. But Schiff said that if Bolton isn't called, The interference is that the president is guilty. The inference is that the president is guilty and his lawyers are basically screaming to the rafters, "Our client is guilty. Our client is guilty. We just don't want the public to see any more evidence of it." And Schiff has also dismissed a suggestion that he could serve as a witness, particularly if Republicans push for a one-for-one trade with Democrats where each party calls a single witness. But they may have to relent in order to get the testimony that they hope would move senators into opposition to Trump. And a lot of senators are picking up on the commentary, is the best I can call it, of Alan Dershowitz yesterday. And fundamentally, as I've said, he believes that nothing that's on the table is impeachable. And that is a talking point that many Republicans are eager to embrace. And in one of his strongest and most quotable statements, Dershowitz said, "Nothing in the Bolton revelations, even if true, would rise to the level of an abuse of power or an impeachable offense." Every day I pause for a second when I remember to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Joe Carson, Robert Hoff, Margaret Anderson, and Abby McMillan. You can join them too. All you have to do is drop by peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and it's easy for you to choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. And should you want to avoid PayPal, you have good reasons, you can address your correspondence to my P.O. Box, number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu eagerly accepted Trump's invitation to come to Washington and declare peace is at hand in the Middle East, even though there's nothing close to that in the offing. And it serves the agenda of an embattled Netanyahu who took the moment of glory with Trump to quietly withdraw his request for immunity from prosecution on corruption charges based on the fact that he is too valuable as prime minister to face justice in the courts in Israel. And it's because it became clear that he didn't have enough votes to get the immunity passed in the Knesset. So he will have to campaign as a defendant in a criminal case heading into the March 2nd, third election in less than a year. Third time he's faced off by Benny Gantz. And this could tilt the balance. But there are other factors at play where the minority parties that support both Netanyahu and Gantz may change their postures based on the maneuvering with Trump and who is embracing or not embracing the Crown Prince Jared Kushner peace plan. So Gantz referred to the peace plan, welcoming it, while distinguishing himself from Netanyahu by indicating he prefers not to move unilaterally but in coordination with Israel's peace partners. So the Palestinians have no role in the negotiations that led to this so-called peace plan. They have rejected it, and this appears to be nothing more than a mutual defense pact between Trump and Netanyahu to distract their respective domestic audiences from their own particular problems. And the rational Zionist Jeremy Ben-Ami, president of the J Street Group, said it's unlikely the plan will win strong Arab support, particularly from Jordan's King Abdullah. So, as I say, I think it's just a photo op for mutual benefit to Trump and Netanyahu. And the actual plan, I'll just thumbnail it for you because, as I say, it's really going nowhere, at least not in the immediate future. But Jared Kushner put it together. This is this is a description from a New York Times article. It is relevant mainly for its potential effect on Israel's March 2 election and as a distraction from the Senate's impeachment trial of Trump. It is described as a two-state solution leading to the creation of some sort of Palestinian state. But by granting grandfather status to the illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank, it will carve up that area in a way that makes a true Palestinian state pretty problematic. And as I mentioned, the allies are jockeying in the Israeli political scene because some of them don't support the embrace of this, and others, like Netanyahu's defense minister, Naftali Bennett, a far, far right-winger. The time for talk is over. Full sovereignty now. Within 2 weeks, we must impose sovereignty over all the settlements. So it's clear to me that there isn't an appetite for peace, at least not among hardline Israelis at this time. An important report from The Guardian. Dateline Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where the consultants on torture to the CIA, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, have been testifying in a hearing related to the trial of the 5 men accused of the masterminding of the attacks on 9/11. And what has surfaced here is that they weren't running the only torture shop under the CIA's umbrella. There was at least one other. First, the officer of the CIA was referred to by the 3-digit code, NZ7. Then they referred to him as the preacher. And, citing a book that James Mitchell wrote, The Guardian identifies the man known as the preacher as Charlie Wise, a CIA agent who died of a heart attack in 2003, just weeks after he apparently was fired from the agency. But according to Mitchell, the preacher would be torturing a guy and at random times would put one hand on the forehead of the prisoner, raise the other high in the air, and in a deep southern drawl say things like, "Can you feel it, son? Can you feel a spirit moving down my arm into your body?" And it appears that Mitchell and Jessen became rivals of Wise, who had his own team he was training to torture at the black site near the airbase outside, the Bagram airbase outside of Kabul, Afghanistan. And at one point, Mitchell visited the site, or actually a different site in Thailand, where Charlie Wise was apparently torturing people with techniques that were not even approved in the torture memos. And this allows Mitchell to portray himself as a moderate who stuck to the rules, and he only tortured people by the book. A book, by the way, that he helped write. It's insidious, but I think it's important to expose the underbelly of Bush's war on terror and the lingering odor of America's gulag, where people go to die, and even if they were guilty, their rights are never honored. In Iowa, the Stop Bernie Sanders efforts are shifting into high gear. Today's episode recounted by the New York Times. Over the weekend, they went to one of those fundraising Democratic dinners on Saturday night. They interviewed 30 undecided Democratic voters as they left the event. Now, as I understand it, there was a big rally either Saturday or Sunday where Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez drew a huge crowd. It's possible that's why none of Sanders' supporters were at this dinner. Anyway, they portray this as a significant group of people, that they're all wrestling with Warren, Klobuchar, Biden, and Buttigieg. And they're all afraid of Bernie. They quote an Iowa Democratic State Representative, Dave Loebsack. "I've told my colleagues all along Bernie Sanders can win with 27% of the vote here." And he's really afraid of that. And as the fear builds, I see a lot more attack language in my Facebook newsfeed, mostly from Biden and Warren supporters who are desperate to keep their candidates in the game as their fortunes slip and Sanders are on the rise. And the New York Times loads this up with their commentary, like, "But even among liberals who admire Sanders' campaign or some of his policy ideas, there is deep concern about the implications of nominating a candidate from the left who President Trump is sure to portray as extreme." Bonnie Campbell, former Iowa Attorney General and a Biden supporter, is predictably quoted, "I think that Bernie is just a bridge too far for the country. I can tell you, I hear from friends and colleagues who say, oh my God, what are we going to do if Bernie wins? And I think that really captures the mentality of the gatekeepers at the New York Times and other media outlets who see stopping Bernie as their higher calling. It's really tragic. But I think the voters are going to prevail, at least based on the polling and the momentum that I see so far. Arizona has suffered a setback in voter suppression. A federal appeals court ruled that certain restrictions in a state with some of the nation's more stringent voting rules should no longer stand. And so Arizona, which is seen as a battleground this year, many voters will find their ballots considerably easier to cast and less likely to be excluded from election night tallies. Because in the past, Arizona voters who cast ballots in the wrong precinct had their votes thrown out. And since 2016, the state has outlawed a popular voting assistance program, letting campaign workers and other outsiders collect voters' mail-in ballots for delivery to polling places. And this is an area of concern, just on an objective basis, because we saw in North Carolina how paid operatives were gaming the absentee ballot system. And essentially, they were trashing ballots that they felt were not going to support the candidates they were being paid by. So while this does appear to ease the suppression tactics in Arizona, are we trading one risk for another? And finally today, Mike Pompeo, who I called an asshole at the end of yesterday's podcast, I am amending that. He is a petty asshole. Because after his bitter exchange with the NPR reporter Mary Louise Kelly, he decided to retaliate against National Petroleum Radio. Now, I joke about NPR, but the State Department has abruptly removed the NPR reporter from the pool of journalists expected to travel to Europe and Asia with the Secretary of State, including a stop in Ukraine. Now, this is really a low move. And if we had a respectable media in this country, they would all refuse to cover Pompeo's trip. Now, at bottom, reporters have a duty that a Secretary of State should not travel abroad representing the United States and dealing in foreign policy without being covered by the press. But when he can choose which reporters get to provide that coverage, we have lost an important element of independence. And at least for show, at least temporarily, we should see an outburst of outrage from Dean Baquet at the New York Times, from other major editors, from the TV news outlets. The silence is deafening. And if you see any effort, like a petition, or any way to publicly speak up and denounce Pompeo's move and come up with a counter move like a boycott of this trip, I hope you will support it and spread the word. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.